Right. I think I am starting to understand how this works. Welcome, Blue Believers, to another episode of the Stamford Sync, where we are syncing up with everything Chelsea FC. And today we are taking a minor detour from transfer news and pre-season stuff and all of the actual interesting stuff that we like about football, the football. And I am going to take a deep dive into the multi-club model. Now, I have already released a video about this, and it was quite specifically pertaining to Strasbourg. But there have been recent developments in the world of the multi-club model that have made me think, oh man, I really need to figure out how this works. So, I am here to answer a couple of questions today. What Chelsea are currently do to build their multi-club model, how it will benefit us in the long term, but what we need to watch out for, and most importantly, why have Crystal Palace just been demoted to the Conference League from the Europa League when Man City were allowed to play in the Champions League alongside Girona last season? Because that is the big one. And guys, if you are enjoying the content and would like to see more, please do me the distinct honour of liking or sharing the video, or subscribe to the channel, or just roast me in the comments, whatever gets you through your day. Right, so the multi-club model. Now, Blueco have been in tow for 3-4 seasons now, and they kind of came in from the off and they were talking like, we like the Red Bull club model, we like the Man City group club model, we are going to do something like that. So there was a lot of conversations, it didn't happen straight away, but eventually we ended up taking a minority share in Strasbourg. And this is another important thing to note about the multi-club models, right, is for the most part, secondary ownership is normally a minority stake. And that is probably largely to avoid some of the problems that we're going to get into, but it's enough for the clubs to be connected together in the way that they can, utilize each other's scouting networks and share commercial stuff. And, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. And originally we were talking to Lyon about potentially purchasing them, which would have been a pretty big deal, man. Lyon are a big club, but we did eventually settle on Strasbourg, which in the grand scheme of things over the last few years has gone pretty well. You see it all the time. It's, always in the conversation. We're loaning players to them. We're buying players from them. Most recently we've just sold Matisse Amugu over there, who's a player we've only had on the books for 6 months. So we've made a small profit on him within 6 months, and he's gone to Strasbourg, which essentially, if he does well there, we'll just buy him back. And I've mentioned before how I think that part of this is to kind of circumvent the limitations of the current loan system and, to be able to trade players without there being inflated prices between clubs and, to avoid squad bloat. And, there's loads of different reasons that we're getting into it. So as of recently, there's been a little bit more news about Chelsea expanding their multi-club model. We have recently been in talks with Portuguese giants Sporting Lisbon about buying a minority share in their club. And you can see, obviously, we've had a few purchases recently. We bought Dario Isugo and Giovanni Quenda, and it seems like we might have been starting to lay some groundwork for a new relationship with Sporting Lisbon. So on the face of it, it's easy to see why the multi-club model is a good idea for the parent company, right? For the holding company, which in this case is Chelsea. We've all been there before, right? Obviously, Chelsea, even before Blueco came in tow, Abramovich was all about the loan army, wasn't he? The loan army, we had 30, 40 players out on loan all at a time, and then obviously, I think it was FIFA that came in, or it might have been UEFA, I'm not sure, but they were like, no, can't do that anymore, 15 players, that's your lot, and, we kind of ruined that for everyone. So the multi-club model makes sense. We can do things like sell them Diego Moreira and Matisse Amugu, but retain some sort of, independent interest and ownership in them. So if they do go on to do well there, we can buy them back ourselves and sell them on for higher prices. If you're depending on where you want the money to go, there's so many obvious reasons why the multi-club model is good for the big club. There's lots of conversations to be had about how good it is for the small clubs, though. The thing I largely talked about in my Strasbourg video was the club culture side of it, right? So Strasbourg had gotten into the top division in France before Blueco bought them, and they, sort of been the equivalent to the French Championship and got into Ligue 1, which is the equivalent of the Premier League, but in France. And they had some sort of up and downs. They had like 15th finish, 13th finish, and then a 6th place finish, which was really good. That was all before we bought them. And then they kind of dropped off again, and that's in and around when Blueco swooped in and bought their minority stake in the club. And what proceeded to happen was basically exactly what happened at Chelsea. They absolutely tore apart their team of experienced professionals and started replacing them en masse with youth. So that's hard for any club, right? And obviously for Chelsea, it's a little bit different because we're spending 100 mil on your Caicedos and your Enzo Fernandez's, but Strasbourg aren't doing that. And the thing that makes it difficult from the perspective of being a fan of that club, you now just see yourself as an extended academy or like a side project to the main club, right? Is like, you don't see Blueco having a big influence on your club saying, we want Strasbourg to win things. You're saying we actually want them to not get too far towards the Champions League because that might cause us problems. So there's a conversation there about, does it actually limit the potential for success? And this is part of what I'm going to get into today. So it's been really, really complicated for a few different reasons, but TLDR, technically the answer to, does being part of a multi-club model with a bigger parent club limit your opportunity for success? Technically, the answer is no. So what this brings me to is the most recent news about Crystal Palace getting into the Europa League and being demoted to the Conference League, which has actually allowed Nottingham Forest to take their place. So even though Crystal Palace won the FA Cup and should rightly be playing in the Europa League based on their team performance, and Nottingham Forest finished in a spot that got them Conference League, they've actually now swapped round because of this multi-club thing. And it just blew my mind, man. I was like, oh, I assumed that maybe it wasn't a big deal because I know that last season, Man City and Girona both played in the Champions League. They are both part of the multi-club model. So I assumed, okay, so there's something there to say it's okay, but then this has just happened and I'm like, oh, what's happening? So I'm going to start going through the detailed nuance about why this is and why it's actually promising for us as Chelsea fans about why this might not be a big problem in the future. When I did my Strasbourg video, the question that I raised at the end of the video was, if we buy Sporting Lisbon and Sporting Lisbon, Strasbourg and Chelsea all get into the Champions League, then what? And what if we buy like a Bundesliga club or something else and we're all getting in these same competitions? It's just going to be a mess, isn't it? Now, it could get messy if it isn't handled properly, but what I've learned today actually tells me that if things are done the right way, there are ways to allow these clubs, despite being owned by the same parent groups and people have minority stakes in them and whatever, there is a way for them to be able to compete in the same European competitions if their clubs have been successful in their own right. So hang on to your hats. I'm going to start getting into some of the rules, the articles, if you will, from UEFA about the rules about multi-club ownership and competing in UEFA's competitions at the same time. So UEFA says that clubs cannot compete in the same competitions if they are owned or controlled by the same person or entity. That person has decisive influence over both clubs. Now, there is some important context to this as well. UEFA defines decisive influence as owning 30% or more of the shares, which technically still makes it a minority share if it's below 50, and if that individual has something like veto power, shared scouting databases, or transferring 3+ players in between these same owned clubs in the same season. So in a nutshell, if you own 30% or more than a club, you are deemed to have decisive influence. If you have transferred 3 players, whether it be loans or sales, between your club in one season, 3 or more, then that is also a no. And essentially, if the person that owns the second club has direct or indirect involvement in things like management, administration, or overall team performance. So those are the rules that dictate whether UEFA say, you've got too much influence in that club for us to consider you not to really be part of it. So you could have like 20% stake in a club and not really get involved in the transfers or the direction of the club at all or anything like that. And this kind of thing wouldn't be a problem because you are basically just seen as like a shareholder rather than like part of the actual running entity. But if you own 30% or more and you're actually getting involved in the stuff that's going on in this second club, then you are deemed to have too much involvement. And basically that says that you and this other team are essentially being run and controlled and decisions are being made by the same person. So that is a no as far as UEFA are concerned. I hope you're keeping up with me. I'm trying my absolute hardest to make this digestible. Okay, so those are the rules. Now let's take a look at the differences between Crystal Palace and Lyon, who have shared ownership from one guy, and Man City and Girona, who are both part of the City Football Group. So a man named John Textor owns 43% of Crystal Palace and 90% of Lyon, the French club. Both of these clubs qualified one way or the other for the Europa League by the end of the season. Palace tried to argue that John Textor did not have any direct influence or control, but UEFA said, no, we deem that he does. So essentially, the reason that Palace missed out and it wasn't a problem for Man City and Girona was to do with something that UEFA has called the Blind Trust Programme. Now, this essentially says that before the deadline of March the 1st, if you declare that you're placing one of your clubs into the Blind Trust Programme, then you are essentially giving up your right to be involved in or control anything that goes on with that club for the next season. So in the case of Man City and Girona, this is exactly what happened. So Man City and Girona were both looking like they were going to get into the Champions League based on their league campaigns the season that they did. So before March the 1st, the City Football Group put Girona in the Blind Trust Programme, which essentially said, for the next season, the City Football Group are not going to have direct control over what happens with Girona. And they're not going to share the scouting stuff or anything that I just talked about before. All of that is going to be held by an individual trustee appointed by UEFA and monitored by UEFA for that entire season. So the club is still going to be allowed to run itself and have its own structure and hierarchy like it already does, but they won't be able to share any of the resources, players or scouting or anything like that in their football group. So essentially what this comes down to is you are allowed to compete in the same competitions if enough time in advance you say to UEFA, we're both going to get in the Champions League next year. As the City Football Group, for instance, we're going to place Girona in this blind trustee programme and someone else is going to control the club for the season that they're in the Champions League. So like that, they don't see any possibility for, I don't know, I'm not even really sure what the problem is, to be honest. Maybe you can tell me in the comments if you can see why it would be such an issue to have, other than it just being a bit greedy. What is the inherent issue of having two clubs with the same ownership competing in the league in the first place? I'm not 100% sure, but this is the reason why City got away with it and the reason that Palace didn't. So to go back to Crystal Palace and Lyon, Crystal Palace didn't qualify for the Europa League via their place in the Premier League table before March the 1st. They qualified in May because they won the FA Cup. And I guess basically they looked at themselves in March and said, we're not sure enough that we're going to win the FA Cup to qualify for Europe, and we're definitely not going to by our league position, so we're not going to put in to UEFA for one of our clubs to be entered into this blind trustee program. So essentially what happened is Crystal Palace just missed the deadline, right? So Crystal Palace got into the Europa League right at the end of the season, and it was already 2 months too late for them to be entered into this thing. So like I said, they tried to fight their case and whatever, but it literally comes down to a deadline. It's a difficult one, right? Because if you qualify for European competition by a cup run that finishes at the end of a season, I guess it is quite difficult to predict, because the football group that you're owned by, in our club it's Blueco, and it's John Texton in the Palace Lyon scenario, it's the City Football Group in the City scenario. You have to preempt that you're likely to get into this European competition next season, and you have to cede control of the club for the entire next season because of it. So I don't know whether that says Palace didn't actually rate their chances at winning the FA Cup. It is fair to assume that, because Palace have never won a trophy before. So it's not crazy, right? But it does seem a little bit unfair that the deadline is before this. So it feels like they're being punished for being successful, doesn't it? It is a bit of a strange one. John Texter did actually try and do something to make this work as well. Now, I'm not sure where they've landed with this, but he sold his shares in Palace and resigned from the Lyon board to show UEFA, look, I'm not having direct involvement. So what I basically think that means is John Texter is not even the guy making the decisions for either of these clubs. I think he is just a majority shareholder, but I don't actually think he's the guy like Daniel Levy at Tottenham, or, Egbali and Bowley at Chelsea, for instance. I don't actually think John Texter's the guy making all the decisions for these clubs. And because of that, like I say, he sold his Crystal Palace shares and he resigned from the Lyon board. Even after doing that, UEFA said, no, unfortunately, you don't qualify. It's too late. You've missed the deadline. And that was the end of it. So, mate, what a nightmare, man. It's so complicated. I said something a little while ago about needing to have a degree in finance to understand being a Chelsea fan these days. It just feels like it's getting more and more like this. To understand these decisions that are going on in football, I had to do so much research to figure all this out. Do you know what I mean? It is a little bit overwhelming, isn't it? But this is the way that it is. A lot of big industries are like this now. The video game industry and the movie industry, all of the big creative decisions and all the big decisions are being made by business people. And we're kind of well past the era where, these luxury entertainment mediums are being controlled by people that are there making and being into the actual entertainment itself. It's all being controlled by business people. And this is another example of this. So I'm not 100% convinced Palace are going to get anywhere with this. They are actually now appealing to the Court of Arbitration of Sport in order to try and get this overturned, citing it as just being unjust and overly technical. And I'm not going to lie to you, I think that's a fair shout. But if it does lead to anything, I imagine it will more likely lead to a rule change for the future than reversing that decision now. And the difficult thing you've got now is UEFA have registered Nottingham Forest as being a Europa League team. So what you do at that point, if you reverse this decision, okay, yeah, cool, you're giving it back to Palace, but then you go into Nottingham Forest and being like, yeah, that Europa League spot we just gave you, yeah, we're taking that back again. So I at this point, I think there's too much water under the bridge. Do you know what I mean? I don't really think you can turn around and just say, okay, sorry, we'll change it all, even if Palace have a really fair point that this is unjust and overly technical. So where does that leave us as Chelsea fans? It actually leaves us with a glimmer of hope. Our board say what you want about them, they are superb businessmen. That is absolutely true. Whether they get all of the footballing decisions right, that's one thing. But so far, they've been pretty good with anything involved on the business side. In the not necessarily likely situation, but the possible situation that we end up buying Sporting Lisbon, and there's some sort of situation where one of Sporting Lisbon or Strasbourg, if not both, looks like they might be getting into the Champions League via their league finish. All Blueco has to do is enter either of these clubs or both of them into the blind trustee program, which basically says we will have no involvement or direct influence in either of those clubs for the season that they are competing in your European competition. May, wow, there's so much in it. But yeah, essentially, there is the workaround, right? There's, so the rule is no, you're not allowed to compete generally in the same competition if you're owned by someone who's got more than 30% control in the club. But there are workarounds, and Crystal Palace were essentially just unlucky that they didn't back themselves to win the FA Cup early enough to say, yeah, actually, we're going to do this because that we might win the FA Cup, get into the Europa League, and then be kicked out of it because there's the multi-club ownership model. So it's a shame, man. It's a shame. Crystal Palace absolutely deserve their spot in the Europa League. And this is kind of what I hinted at before with Strasbourg. If Strasbourg got into the Champions League, based on the team that they are and where they've come from, they would absolutely deserve that, man. Of course they would, because it means they would have had an amazing season in France, playing excellent football and competing with the likes of PSG, Monaco, Lyon, and all of these guys who are, essentially much more developed football teams. Now, if we do buy Sporting Lisbon, you can imagine this is probably going to be a common issue, right? Because Sporting Lisbon do feature in the Champions League reasonably often. So if that is the case and Chelsea are getting in, then we're going to be seeing a lot of this blind trustee thing, man. Do you know what I mean? And that begs the question, what is even the point in investing in a club that is so likely to get into the Champions League so often if we're cutting ourselves off from being able to make use of the multi-club model in buying and selling players and sharing our scouting? But we will just have to see what happens. Essentially, as of right now, I can say yes, it is possible for teams to compete in UEFA competitions at the same time if they are owned by the same people, as long as before March the 1st of the season that they are looking like they're going to qualify for those competitions. They essentially cede control to an independent trustee and agree to be completely overseen and looked into by UEFA for the entirety of that season to make absolutely sure that nothing untoward is happening. So that's basically it. That is basically it. There's a little bit more stuff about the multi-club model pertaining to Chelsea. For instance, we are not stopping at Sporting Lisbon. Chelsea is supposedly interested in getting a foothold with a Belgian team and someone in South America. So if all of this happens, then we're looking to be a 5-6 club model. Do you know what I mean? Now, obviously, Portugal, France and Belgium will be the only teams that would be able to qualify for the Champions League. So it's not like every single one of our teams will kind of run into these problems. But it's enough, right? It is enough to think, oh man, that's a potential problem waiting to happen, isn't it? It's long, it's complicated, but, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We can have the multi-club model. And if in the unlikely situation that 2 or more of our teams qualify for the same competition at the same time, I mean, you've got to think, even if it's not just like the Chelsea angle, right? What if Sporting Lisbon and Strasbourg both get into the Europa League? Do you know what I mean? And that's kind of outside of the Chelsea stuff, but because we're all owned by the same company, that'd be the same conversation to be had. And just as City and Girona have just shown us, as long as the brass, the Blueco boys up top with the, the guys in the suits that do the paperwork, as long as they keep on top of this and they are able to anticipate the likelihood that their team is going to finish in a Champions League spot, then yeah, it can happen. So nice one, guys. I am going to leave it there. This has been a bit of a mind-boggling one, but if you are interested in this kind of thing, and I'm not going to lie, I really am. I find it all absolutely fascinating, morbidly fascinating, you might say. Ultimately, for me, the most important thing is the football, the players on the pitch and how well we do. And, I am a Chelsea fan before anything. This doesn't necessarily make me a Strasbourg fan or a Sporting Lisbon fan by extension, but I definitely take a lot more interest in Strasbourg since they've become part of our football group. So it is expanding my supportership, if you will. Obviously, I'm a Chelsea fan first and always, but I do like the idea of being connected to all of these clubs. And if we can not harm their culture and just allow them to flourish and make sure that things like what's just happened to Crystal Palace doesn't happen and no one gets slapped down for being successful, then yeah, it looks like it can actually just be a really good thing as long as it's managed properly. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for sticking around to the end of the video if you did. As ever, I will be keeping my ear to the ground for more Chelsea news, and as soon as it comes out, I will do my best to endeavour to get it out to you. I hope you guys are having a wicked day, and I will catch up with you really, really soon. Peace.